Welcome to The Killer Psychologist. Today we're going to talk about a Florida doctor, a Florida surgeon. Dr. Thomas Shaknovsky, a surgeon who gained notoriety for a fatal surgical error in August 2024 during a procedure intended to remove 70-year-old William Bryan's spleen at a Sacred Heart Emerald Coast in Miramar Beach, Florida. Dr. Shaknovsky mistakenly removed Bryan's liver, leading to Bryan's death. Following this incident, Dr. Shaknovsky's medical license was suspended by the Florida Department of Health. He also voluntarily surrendered his Alabama medical license in November 2024. In January 2025, Bryan's widow, Beverly Bryan, filed a civil lawsuit against Dr. Shaknovsky, the hospital, and several staff members, alleging medical malpractice and a subsequent cover-up of the surgical error. The lawsuit claims that hospital administrators and staff attempted to conceal the mistake by falsifying records and discouraging an autopsy. As of now, it remains unclear of whether he will face criminal charges. Now I have with us today Dr. Wetter. He's a licensed attorney and a forensic psychologist. I also have a special guest with us today, Shannon Boyett. She's a registered nurse. She's a veteran. And she's a forensic medical records review expert for medical malpractice and wrongful death cases. And I'm excited to have you here today, Shannon. So tell us a little bit how you get involved in cases like this.
So I have attorneys who reach out to me on LinkedIn. I have a LinkedIn profile and they see what I do and they say, hey, can you help? There's plaintiff walks into an office and says, I have surgery, but I don't know what's wrong with my arm because it doesn't work anymore. And I'm handed the medical records and I develop the story from there using medical records. I've been doing it for about 3 years now and I absolutely love it. And I love serving people.
So tell me a little bit about Dr. Shaknovsky. I know you just got some I believe the civil suit complaint, and you were just reviewing that. What did you find?
I found that this man has been grossly, what's the right word I'm looking for? Grossly unmanaged and supervised since he started working at Ascension Sacred Heart in May of 2020. From about 5 months of him starting to work at that hospital, the state of Florida licensing board was receiving complaints about his surgical procedures not going well. Patients were calling them and letting them know something's wrong. He didn't do this right. What I do know from just reading the report put out by the attorney, Mr. Joseph Zazar, he had one other wrong organ surgery last year where he removed a part of the pancreas instead of an adrenal gland.
Once in a while, we get a case where the facts are so egregious that we feel like we need to get on YouTube and whatever other social media channels and tell basically the local public what's going on. We got a case this week that involves a physician that practices at Ascension Sacred Heart Emerald Coast over in Destin. He also has privileges, I believe, at North Walton Doctors Hospital. His name is Dr. Shaknovsky. And he basically performed an operation on our client, intending to take out the spleen, and he inadvertently took out his liver, which killed it on the operating table. We then did some research into this particular doctor, and it turns out this is not the first time he's had a wrong site surgery in the last 2 or 3 years. He, in the last couple of years or so, he actually accidentally took out a portion of somebody's pancreas, intending to take out one of their adrenal glands. So we're dealing with somebody that has a history of wrong site surgery. Unfortunately for our client, what he took out was fatal to Mr. Bryan. His family, of course, has hired us to pursue the case against all the potential defendants, the doctors in the room, potentially the nurses, the hospital, for credentialing issues. All those things are wrapped into one. But the purpose of this video is just to let you know that there is a doctor practicing in Okaloosa Walton area at those two facilities potentially. We don't know for sure if he's still practicing at Sacred Heart. They've disabled his bio on the webpage, but we can't tell whether or not he's still there or not performing surgeries. The other facility, North Walton Doctors Hospital, it appears he's still a chief medical officer of sorts there, and he's still potentially doing surgeries there. I would just caution you that this gentleman has a track record, and so be very careful if he happens to be your treating provider. We'll continue giving you updates as we learn more information about this particular case, and we just wanted to make sure we got this information out there because it's certainly not going to get out there from the hospital.
Before that, he caused sepsis in a patient when he did not correctly reattach the ends of a colon together, what we call reanastomosis. The sutures leaked and the patient wound up passing away from sepsis. In two other cases, he severed vessels. He severed a common bile duct during a gallbladder surgery, and then he also severed a ureter. I think what's most shocking about all of this is that the follow-up by the hospital to make sure he was safe to practice, they didn't follow up. Nobody notified the state of, which is a requirement. When things like this happen during surgical cases, it is a requirement by the hospital to let the state know. And they did not. And so now the hospital is being named in the suit as well. Not just the hospital, but Ascension Sacred Heart, the corporation. So, yeah, it's a devastating case. I read through the surgical notes, the report by ACA, which is a investigative body for the state of Florida. And it is quite evident that even after removing the liver, he refused to acknowledge that it was the liver until he was contacted by investigators, by ACA. And even during that period of time, he maintained that it was the spleen that he removed and not the liver. Even his operative report states he took out a spleen. And let me just point out that there is a very big difference in a liver and a spleen by about 1,600 grams. So
not to mention the anatomical location of the two organs. I mean, they're
completely
in
different sides of the body.
Yeah, they're in different sides of the body as well. So I don't know. I would, and this will be interesting to explore in terms of his training. I know he's a doctor of osteopathy, which is he has a DO degree, and he went to the Chicago School of Osteopathic Medicine. So I'm wondering if you, and I'm sure this is going to be done obviously through discovery, but what did his training look like? I mean, when he was in undergoing residency in surgery, because he's a general surgeon, so he had to undergo a surgical residency. And I'm just wondering about how did he get through that?
That's my question too. Are we looking at another Dr. Death where he did not complete all the requirements of his training? Unfortunately, I'm not privy to that information, but that's a really good question because one of the nurses who was interviewed by ACA stated that while she was working at another hospital in Colorado, she heard about him there before she came to Sacred Heart Hospital on the Emerald Coast to work. So, yeah, if you're being heard of that far away, there's definitely some things that were not followed up on by hospital administrators, by managers, by directors, especially surgical directors. The mentioned mistakes, the mistakes that I mentioned before, if I am reading the paperwork correctly, the documentation in both the suit that was filed and the ACA report, none of it was ever mentioned in the event reporting system that we are required to use when there is a mistake or even a near mistake. If you walk into a patient's room with the wrong medication and you scan it and you have, oh, this is an error, that's a near miss, you're still supposed to document that. So the system had not been used as it was designed to be used. And so the following of his mistakes was very, very bad. That's the only word I can come up with.
Yeah, this is where again, the hospital can also have legal liability as well. And of course, I always have to qualify this when we talk about legal issues, because this is the state of Florida. And I just want to, put it on the record. I'm not a licensed attorney in Florida. So I can't give any kind of specific legal opinion regarding Florida law, but I can certainly give general information about my understanding of the statutory schemes in Florida.
Like I mentioned earlier, they're going after the hospital. They're going after Ascension Sacred Heart Corporation. And I think they should.
Every once in a while, we get a case where the facts are so egregious and dangerous to the local public that we feel like we should stop what we're doing, basically, and put out like a public service announcement. This is one of those situations. We've got a client that underwent a surgery that was supposed to be a spleen surgery, splenectomy, where they remove your spleen because you don't technically need your spleen to live. And the physician mistook his liver for the spleen, which is obviously on the other side of your body and much different in shape and size, and removed our client's liver, which unfortunately killed him, on the table there, and then proceeded to call it a spleen. Once we got the case this week, we looked into this gentleman's background. His name is we'll put his picture up. His name is Dr. Shaknovsky. Once we did some research into him, we found out that this was not the first time he had done a wrong site surgery. And in the recent past, last 2 or 3 years, he actually operated on somebody over at Ascension Sacred Heart, Emerald Coast. And he was intending to take out an adrenal gland, and he ended up taking out part of the pancreas of another patient. So once we found out this man had a track record, and the hospital basically seemed to be putting up with his behavior, up until at least this point, we felt like it was necessary to let you know. He also has privileges at a hospital, North Walton Doctors Hospital. I believe he's like a chief medical officer of sorts there. So if you happen to be a patient of his and you're getting ready to undergo any kind of surgery with him, I would certainly tell you to second guess that, given what we know about this particular physician. You're not going to hear this from the hospital. You're certainly not going to hear this from the doctors. So this has felt like it was a big enough deal when you mistake the liver for the spleen, to let you know about it.
We were talking earlier before the podcast started, and one of the reasons why I got into legal nurse consulting and doing what I do is because I worked with physicians who made mistakes, and I did not hear or see of any repercussions. I have worked 6 years with physicians who I saw make some pretty significant mistakes, and you don't ever hear of them getting in trouble. And to watch your patients suffer and not be treated as well as they should be treated was very frustrating. So I asked myself, how could I help this issue? Because being a nurse at bedside, they do not listen to you. You can make event reporting system. And that's probably, and I want to back up and say the event reporting system was not used as it should have been. But I will tell you, when you put in an ERS, as it is known, nothing ever happens. You don't, not that I had seen. Of course, they probably keep physician business to themselves, but you see a physician make a grievous error and you still see him shift after shift after shift. You don't see the remedial training that's recommended. You don't see any supervision of the physician. And so I think that is my goal working in the legal community, is to point these issues out. And of the cases I have taken, I have seen some very significant issues of not doing the right thing, even when you're doing something wrong. And I think part of the reason this suit is so big is because the hospital failed to report it. This was a sentinel event.
Yeah, I was going to say these are sentinel events that have to be reported, and I'm assuming this is a JCO accredited hospital. So that's the Joint Commission that comes out and regularly, like, they audit essentially the hospital, all the policies, protocols, everything is audited. I'm wondering about what, if you know this, what has JCO said about this particular hospital, or have they had issues with accreditation in the past?
Of the 6 years I worked there, I did not hear of any issues. There were deficiencies that he allowed the hospital to correct before they went off site and put their report in, but it was only associated with paperwork. Well, you didn't have this in this medical chart, or this particular thing wasn't followed up on after surgery with a patient. So just go on ahead and pencil whip those and fix it, and we'll call it good. And that, honestly, that's just from me as a bedside nurse. I was never privy to all the conversations, of course. And honestly, I never liked being there when Jaco was there. So I told him, because they knew I would be a little vocal, so they never scheduled me. On those days, we knew Jaco was walking into the door. So,
Yeah. When
Shannon
I was
Shannon wasn't known for being well behaved.
Right. They make sure. I mean, when I was assigned to a major hospital campus when I was a police officer, I was their hospital officer. Essentially, it was a Kaiser Permanente healthcare system. It was a very large, level. It was a level 1 trauma center at the time, but large hospital. I do remember when Jaco was coming in, they were always making sure that they had the right people in place when those auditors were on site. So, I mean, yes, accrediting and auditing and all that stuff is important, but I think we also recognize that, hospital administrators, unless it's an unscheduled visit, which I understand they do that as well. Sometimes they'll come and it'll be a surprise visit, and which, might catch them off guard. That's just something that I think would be important to, look at with this hospital, see if again, some of that stuff may or may not be public record either, right? Like,
right.
It may not be publicly available information, but that would be interesting to know. I'm sure the attorneys are going to be looking into this during discovery and when they start deposing administrators.
Right. I have tried to look for Jaco reports. I've never seen them. The ACA reports are what's public, and those are the ones who investigate the sentinel events. From my understanding, they also investigate nursing homes as well. But yeah, this case is. I want to talk about a little bit too. Is something that the surgeon, Dr. Shaknovsky, did not mention in his report was that the patient had a megacolon. And so it reduced visibility into the abdomen. And the nurses who were in the room, they were all holding that colon in the proper position and did not see what Dr. Shaknovsky was doing. When he severed the vena cava is when all hell broke loose. And in the process of trying to save the patient's life is when Dr. Shaknovsky removed that liver. And it was when he had no visibility into the abdomen. He kept working. Instead of stopping the bleeding or trying to find the source of bleeding, he proceeded to take out the liver. And the autopsy report made by the medical examiner stated exactly the liver was autopsied out of that man. In other words, there was no clamps, there was no sutures, there was no ligation, there was no cautery, nothing to take the liver out of him.
So he just essentially, did he bleed out? I'm making an assumption, but yeah, with no cauterization or anything. I mean, I'm not a medical doctor, but a little bit of understanding of that. But yeah, obviously that's a very vascular organ, right? Like there's it's we've got portal veins and things that are So there's going to be a lot of bleeding, right? If you don't.
Well, he's apparently at one point in time, he actually picked up one of the vessels in his finger. It was pulsing a little bit. He's like, "Oh, that's troubling." Oh, didn't know what vessel he was touching.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Whoa. So this goes back to the issue of like training. I'm just curious about, again, what is interesting here too is that when you mentioned this is a negligent, so they filed a civil suit, right? That's right. That's the theory. Legal theory here is going to be, medical malpractice, negligence. It's going to be a negligence analysis. But where it can become criminal, at least my understanding in Florida law, is when there's reckless disregard for patient safety or for the life of a patient, then that could potentially cross over into criminal liability. And again, I don't know whether that's being investigated, and you might have insights on that. But that's something definitely that I think is worthy of discussing.
So I do know there is a criminal case open. The last time I checked the public record, and according to local news sources, I do know that he acted recklessly when he fired a stapler into the patient's abdomen blindly. And that is what started the heavy bleeding. I'm assuming he severed the vena cava when he did that. And the patient proceeded to bleed out in code, which, as you know, heart stops.
Yep.
That's death, right?
Right.
And
Well,
so
but yeah, his blood pressure is going to drop and he's going to, he probably went into cardiac
there's no
arrest.
perfusion anywhere, brain
Correct.
starting to die,
Right.
and any life-saving measures after. So that's your recklessness. That's your reckless behavior that I immediately honed in on. It wasn't until he severed that vena cava, the patient really declined. And then he acted horribly afterwards by proceeding to take out the liver and then lying to that's the biggest. He lied to the family, lied to them, not only, and then yelled at the nurses and told them, you better label that as a spleen, because he took the liver out. They went to put it in a specimen container and they're like, are you sure you want me to label this as spleen? And he said, yes, it's a spleen. And made it all the way to pathology until it was positively identified as a liver.
And yeah, you can, again, basic anatomy, it's like a liver and a spleen. This is something that medical students learn, in the first year of medical school. It's not like, like basic anatomy, right? Like
my fifth grader can open up a book and say, Mom, that's a liver.
Yeah, exactly. You can't really mistake it.
No. It's not a completely different color than the spleen. It's a few shades off of red, but the surface is different.
There's
shape.
The
shape. There's lobes. There's 2 different lobes to the liver. Sometimes there's 3. There's different vessels. It's in a completely different place to the body. I read the suit that they filed formally. I just now read it today. It was filed on the 30th of January. And I'm gobsmacked. You hear me pausing is because I'm speechless. I'm still speechless. Reading new information that that I'm learning about, reading the suits, the paper, the work that was filed with the courts. I don't know. I hope he's got a good attorney.
Well,
I really do.
You mentioned tort reform in Florida, and I looked at that real quickly, and it's similar to other states, not California, but other states in which they cap damages depending on the level of negligence and what happened, whether if someone died or not. There's a cap, I believe, of $1 million. So they can't, when you sue, even if you're demanding punitive damages, and again in this case, if it's gross negligence, sometimes depending on the state, you can seek punitive damages, not just general damages, but punitive damages are generally when you have to have it's an intentional tort that permits, a punitive damage award. So, reckless disregard, in other words, if this rises to a criminal level, then I think there's a possibility, but it looks like in Florida, there's caps on this. Like it's $1 million, right? Like my understanding, and again, I'm not an attorney in Florida, but.
Right. And I was looking through the court documents today, and the only number I see is 50,000. And I'm like, granted, I've not seen the whole length of it, but I'm only seeing 50,000, which I know is not going to be correct. It can't be. But I'm still understanding what tort reform is. As a nurse, I don't know the legal jargon very well
tort,
at all.
Yeah. Whenever you hear that term tort reform, what that speaks to is it speaks to generally capping damages. So in cases in civil cases where, again, if we're talking about an intentional tort is something like, for example, battery. And this is something that could be filed, if it could be proven that this surgeon, kind of like Dr. Death, if you recall this guy, that was an intentional tort. Battery is the legal theory for that. And so, that's an intentional tort, meaning damages are looked at differently. But when we're talking about negligence, that's not an intentional tort. So, because if it's ordinary negligence, it's just, it's considered accidental. It's like a breach. There's a duty of care, a standard of care, right? That's accepted in the community. And, if a physician breaches that duty, right? And then there's there's damages that result from that in this case, the patient died, but, then as long as they can prove causation, then they can seek damages. But again, going back to those, I don't know how they're going to, it sounds like the suit they filed, it's going to be, it's gross negligence is what they're alleging, in the complaint, right? Is that the original? I don't know if they're also pleading a battery as well, which again, a battery again would be, it sounds strange that, the doctor didn't punch the guy or that's not the context in which battery is used. It's if you physically, harm somebody, in other words, you injure them, and it's intentional, that's a battery, basically.
Mm-hmm. And something else you can educate me on is at the top of the form, I see plaintiff versus all the defendants. But I also see jury trial demanded.
Yeah, that's pled in the complaint, and that's because that's what you do. If you're filing suit, you demand a jury trial, right? Now, most cases like this may not make it to jury trial. As we know, the majority of both civil and criminal cases resolve through either mediation, which is a pre-trial procedure that, both parties have to agree to, or, there's, in some cases, there's what's called a summary judgment motion that gets filed. And in those instances, if there's no triable issues, meaning the judge finds there's no triable issues of fact, then the judge can actually dismiss the case either with or without prejudice. I'm not saying that'll happen here. Obviously, it sounds like the evidence is is overwhelming here, right? From what you're describing, but
yes, it is.
Yeah. So, but again, then oftentimes, as we know, these cases will settle out, right? The attorneys for the defense will make an offer for settlement, or and oftentimes they do settle, but sometimes they don't, and they end up going to a full jury trial, where again, if I had this case, and I was doing this, I would be looking for ways to file an intentional tort, meaning I'm going to try to get punies, which are punitive damages. But and again, going back to tort reform, it's like with tort reform, these can be capped in some jurisdictions where, they put a cap. In other words, you hear all these cases, sexual harassment cases, $25 million set, jury award. That's a jurisdiction in which tort reform hasn't, been fully enacted, where damages are unlimited, because punitive damages they're an amount that are determined by the jury oftentimes, right? So, but if you're an attorney filing suit, you're going to throw a number in there. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't, but oftentimes it's in the millions, right? But generally the jury is the one that makes that, will decide that. That's an issue of fact that is tried by the jury. So yeah, in this case, it sounds just like this is a negligence case that's been filed. They don't have, I haven't seen the complaint, so I don't know if there's any other allegations in the complaint, because they'll plead them in the beginning of the complaint.
I can certainly send that link to you when we come off the podcast. But I've got both the ACA report and what they filed with the local court system in Walton County, and it's 445 pages long, so it's a good bedtime story.
I looked for it while we were talking, and I couldn't find an actual. Sometimes when the news media is involved, they will get a copy of the complaint, because complaints, when they're filed in the courts, those are public record. You can go down to the courthouse and you can get a copy of those, and you can read them. In most jurisdictions, unless there's some type of a gag, put on the complaint, but by the judge. But in most cases, you can get a copy of those.
Joseph Cesar actually put it on his website.
Oh, okay.
He does, yeah. So that's where I found it. It's the first.
I can find it then. Yeah,
it's the latest blog post he put up discussing the case. So psychologically, I wonder where he was at during all of this.
That's what I want Dana to talk about. What are we, again, we don't want to spec you, because we haven't evaluated this guy, but we can talk in hypotheticals.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of times I'm hired by the plaintiff in civil lawsuits and I'm assessing psychological damages, like, for example, I'd be hired um, by the widow's family to assess her psychologically. And a lot of times I'm not assessing the perpetrator that caused these damages. So doing their psychological evaluation. But I see all the records and I see a lot of information that tells me, wow, this guy, huh? And the most interesting thing is even when it's a successful lawsuit, right, for damages, later I'm wondering, why did this guy get charged criminally? And I find that very interesting. But as far as the psychological traits of some of these individuals, I see a common theme, and it's coming up again and again for me, and that's why I'm it's not surprising, but I do all kinds of psychological evaluations for across settings, and I see different things, child custody, right? Criminal evaluations, like all kinds of things. And there are some certain traits that I find to be quite harmful. And narcissistic traits in people, these folks, they don't take feedback at all very well. And they can be quite retaliatory if you even attempt to give them any feedback about themselves, like threatening or challenging you. I have personally attempted to give people feedback when I find that they have, say, narcissistic personality disorder. Sometimes you'll see some antisocial traits in there or other traits, right? They disagree with you. Surprise. They will project things on me saying I'm wrong or I'm flawed but they'll never take personal responsibility. And so the reason why people should be cleared psychologically before being fit for duty is that we see some of these traits, and I won't clear people for duty. I have, in fact, came across profiles. Recently, somebody wanted to get into the military and they had narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and they had a number of other problems. And I told them why I wasn't clearing them. And alarmingly, there are a lot of places that don't use psychologists to clear professionals to see if they're fit for duty. And I think it's a huge miss. It's a huge problem. And like medical doctors, what is the criteria for them? Who is evaluating them? They're a surgeon. And this is a matter of life and death. They need to be fit. What are the checks and balances? And, I worked in surgery for almost 4 years. Back in the day, I was like a glorified secretary. So I saw a lot of things. I'd go in the surgery room in and out. And anyway, I ended up deciding that wasn't a career field for me. But I observed a lot of the behaviors of the surgeons. Fast forward 20 years, I became a forensic psychologist, and I was actually hired last year to go back to one of these hospitals because the surgeon I needed to do a critical incident debriefing with the staff in the OR regarding a surgeon who was acting inappropriately. And it was alarming that I hadn't been called, that this had been going on for years or decades. I was in shock what I heard, what was happening, and the behaviors of this person. And I can tell you that things were reported, but the CEO or people in charge that make millions of dollars by continuing to allow the surgeries to happen was pretty motivating. So these bad behaviors that were happening, although they were reported, And it still continues to go on. Like, what is happening? How is this person continuing to practice? Who is stopping them? And I did file a complaint with the medical board with the information that I heard, and nothing happened. But I felt an obligation, a duty to warn.
I can honestly, so reading the complaint that was filed in the court today, they were well aware of this man, the hospital CEO, the OR managers. Everyone was well aware of his issues. He had the highest volume of cases every day in that hospital. And so that is being named in the suit, that they kept him working because of the money he was bringing in. No matter how much he was hurting people, people died. People died before this case, and they still had this man working. And to the fact, well, to what you said about the psychopathy of surgeons, I know a lot of good physicians. I know a lot of very reasonable, well-adjusted surgeons and physicians that I would trust with my own life and the life of my children. But in the case here, and some of the cases I personally experienced, those few bad apples, for whatever reason, they're the ones who work the most. They're the ones who work the most, and as a result, cause the most damage. And I think they're willing to work and bring in the money, and this is just my hypothesis. They're willing to work and bring in the money, so hospitals just, okay, we'll just pay them off, or we'll just slip this under the rug. And that's what has happened here. The hospital continued to let him work without remedial training or appropriate remedial training. What they call immediate remedial training, when he took out the pancreas instead of the adrenal gland, it was part of a pancreas. What they call a remedial training was a joke. From my perspective, it was 6 supervised cases and then going through some online training and testing. That was it. And then they proceeded to cancel or not offer that type of surgery at that hospital anymore. So I still have not found where he even completed the 6 supervised surgeries to verify that he was competent. So,
yeah, and how many 6 surgeries? I mean, are you going to get a good representation of general? If you're a general surgeon, and there's lots of different surgeries you can do.
Correct.
Yeah, I just thank you for telling me about the lawsuit on the website. And by the way, it actually almost caused my computer to shut down because it is almost 500 pages.
Mm-hmm.
This complaint is huge. So whoever put that together was burning the midnight oil. That is anyway. I looked at the legal theories because that's why I wanted to see. And yes, they do have a gross negligence claim included, which gross negligence permits, at least from what I see in Florida, the recovery of punitive damages. And that's big because punitive damages are those, damages that are intended to punish somebody for, again, in this case, gross negligence. Again, the question here is what I'm interested to find out is whether or not the district attorney in this county, there'll be a criminal investigation, like you said, that's ongoing. Remember that in criminal cases like this, the burden is high. They have to prove that his conduct was not just ordinary negligence, not even gross negligence, but they're going to have to prove that he acted with such reckless disregard for, the safety of the patient that it rises to a criminal standard. And so it'll be interesting to see whether or not, and again, I can't, I don't have access to the investigation, so I wouldn't want to give an opinion about whether there's enough there, but that's worth talking about because what you're describing here, it does sound like there's evidence supporting this, right? Like in terms of just, this is not just ordinary negligence or incompetence. It's, there's conduct and behavior covering things up, for example, covering up these mistakes. Allegedly lying about, what was done in the procedures, those sorts of things, instead of taking, responsibility and, ownership of what happened. So all of that's going to be certainly looked at. And so the prosecutor has to decide, determine well, do we have enough to reach this criminal standard? And then if, again, they're looking at it also as, can we get a conviction, right, in a jury trial on something like this? Because, that's, the burdens are much higher. So anyway, that's interesting that this case is fascinating in terms of where it might go, both criminally and civilly.
Yeah. I agree.
It looks like the Walton County Sheriff's Office is actively investigating the case in collaboration with the state attorney's office, the District 1 medical examiner, and the Florida Department of Health.
Right.
So when are we going to get, when is this going to go before a grand jury, right? To indict him on charges. Like, what are we waiting for? It may or may not go to a grand.
It could go to a grand jury. It depends, on the prosecutor has discretion generally in these cases they can go the grand jury route, or they can just, if they think they've got enough evidence, beyond a reasonable doubt evidence. In other words, they can move forward and just file the criminal complaint themselves, in the district court there.
So in what cases would they take it before a grand jury?
It's remember, with grand juries, it's not adversarial. And so, when you take a case to the grand jury, the prosecutor, oftentimes they'll do this if they suspect that, God, this is kind of like, we're not really sure we have enough. And so they let the grand jury look at the evidence. Remember, the defense isn't available to repose or refute anything during a grand jury proceeding. So it's only the prosecutor that's presenting testimony or evidence. And then the grand jury, will make a decision, a charging decision, basically. So they step in the shoes of the prosecutor, basically, if they choose to indict or not. So they're instructed when they're doing this, that they know what the burdens are. So the burden, they make a charging decision that's based off of, is there sufficient evidence to proceed to trial? Meaning, is there probable cause, that a crime has occurred, right? And this defendant is responsible for the commission of that crime, and then they will decide to indict or not. Now, again, depends on the jurisdiction, but sometimes it's a strategic, decision to let the grand jury do it, because they're saying, well, it's a jury of your peers that are they're the ones that are making the decision to indict. But that doesn't mean he's convicted. That just means he's gonna face trial, right? With a different jury, that's going to be selected in the criminal case. So, there's strategic reasons why a prosecutor may choose to go to the grand jury with a case versus like just filing it themselves. And that's something they, discuss amongst themselves based on, the weight of the evidence, the strength of the evidence they have in the case.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens on behalf of the family. I know Mr. Bryan was a very active person, still living a very full life. And he had some problems he needed to go to the hospital for. And his wife's actually a nurse. And so I think I don't know how she was notified of the mistake, but I think when she was told that he hemorrhaged and he passed away, something leads me to believe her spidey senses were up. And especially since it wasn't just a surgeon that told them the spleen was taken out. Some of the hospital staff told her that as well, even though they knew. So, on behalf of the family, I really hope that they get all of the compensation that they deserve. I hope that this also wakes up hospital corporations. I know Dr. Death wasn't enough to wake up hospital corporations, and the CEO being killed was not enough to wake up hospital corporations. What's really going to wake them up? I don't know. And to me, from my perspective, I help people hit them in the pocketbook. You're going to pay some money for this. And then the poor nurses are going to get new protocols upon new protocols to follow and more paperwork to fill out. And they're kind of like, why are we filling this out? And oh, by the way, some surgeon in some far off land did this. And so now we're all filling out more paperwork, and it doesn't really help. So, yeah.
Let's talk about that pocketbook and money. So the hospital administration, the CEO that's raking in millions of dollars through these surgeries, let's do the math. How much is a civil suit going to cost them in the end?
That's a Dr. Craig.
Well, but yeah, that's why it goes back to this issue of tort reform. So, Florida is, it's a pretty conservative state, right? Overall. So you generally will see in more conservative or red states, you will see pushes for tort reform. And again, like trial lawyers associations, which a long time ago, I was a member of the largest like trial lawyers association in the United States. And of course they staunchly oppose and are, do not want to see tort reform, and for obvious reasons, because, when you cap these damages, when you cap the ability of, an attorney to get, punitive damages in the millions, like what you're saying, Dana, hit them hard, right? But remember, these administrators generally, they're not paying out of their own pockets. This is the corporation, the liability carriers who, are insuring these hospital systems that are the ones that are paying out, that it's very rare that, any individual is held personally liable. And in some cases, if they're acting outside the scope of practice and, they're violating policies and things like that, there's things that, certain like employers can say, well, we're not going to indemnify you, meaning, you're on your own. Like if you get sued as an individual, your own med malpractice, policy will be implicated here. And so for this doctor, he has his own med mal insurance, which in some jurisdictions, they actually do not require doctors to have malpractice insurance. And it depends on the state. Like, I know that in California that some psychologists, for example, they don't have malpractice insurance. They're not required by law to carry it. I'm not sure about Florida, but there's pockets of, people who are going to pay or entities that are going to pay in this. It's going to be like his med mal policy. I'm sure he had malpractice insurance. Surgeons' malpractice insurance is some of the highest. I think my understanding is anesthesiologists and surgeons generally have much higher med mal because, it costs more because obviously risks are much higher, like risk, in this case, surgical errors, things like that can cost a lot of money in terms of litigation and damages and all that kind of stuff when there's negligence involved. So yeah, if they cap it, from what I see, it's looking like they might be capped in Florida. They might be capped at $1 million on punitive damages. I'm not sure if there's going to be some other legal theory they can use to go after, and get a higher damage if they're trying to seek that. But so in 2003, I'm just going to say this real quick. Florida passed legislation that caps non-economic damages, that's pain and suffering, and med malpractice cases at $500,000 for physicians and $1 million in cases involving death or catastrophic injury. Now, again, that's the information that I can see that's publicly available. I'm not sure how that's being, enforced right now. So, and then it looks like the Florida Supreme Court did overturn this. This statute, the statutory scheme was overturned in 2017. So I'm glad I looked at that. So it looks like there might have been, again, a case precedent that was set that overturned this statute as unconstitutional. And, so perhaps there is a potential for higher non-economic damage awards in this case. So they might be able to get more.
That's good to know. That from whatever I had read that Florida had capped damages, but what you're telling me is no, and that the Bryan family could be well compensated for this.
Yeah, it's very possible. Let me just pull the case up. It looks like this case, the title is, and I'm going to verify it, North Broward Hospital District versus Gallatin, and that's in 2017. So I'm just going to look at it real fast. I'm just curious about this. This is the thing, just because a law is passed by a legislature does not mean that it gets upheld, right? In other words, there can be constitutional tests to the constitutionality of statutes, and in this case, that's what happened. It looks like they overturned it. They under a premise that it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. So that looks like that got overturned. That was a Florida Supreme Court. It wasn't the U.S. Supreme Court. So interesting. So yeah. Yep, that is a case Yep. in North Broward Hospital District versus Gallatin. Yeah, there's a citation here for that. So yeah, interesting. Okay, well, there you go. Maybe they're going to be, they could be potentially successful here. And when you talk punitive damages, if there's no caps, someone's life, right? It can be high, very high, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, for sure.
I'd like to see some criminal charges.
I would too.
Well, it's Florida, so you very well may see criminal charges, because that's the other thing that's, Florida. Florida tends to hold people accountable, right? If they're involved, if they engage in criminal conduct and they can prove it, they tend to get held accountable in Florida. At least that's my understanding of Florida. It's a little different in other states. What you can all figure out, what I'm talking about. Other states tend to let things go more often.
Well, and just off the top of my head, reading the autopsy report and the statements made by medical staff to ACA, again, he didn't use any clamps, no cross clamping before cutting, no sutures used to close vessels, no ligature, no cautery,
cauterizations, none of that stuff to stop the bleeding.
And then firing a stapler blindly into an abdomen.
Yeah, so it goes back to the whole issue of training. So like, if he was trained properly on these, which, I'm not a surgeon, so I have watched surgeries, by the way. I've been in the surgical field, so to speak, and have like watched surgeries go on, like gunshot victims where they're cauterizing, they're clamping, they're suturing, they're stopping internal bleeding, right, in organs and stuff. So, I've watched it, but it's like, if he was trained, properly, which you go to medical school, right? I mean, I teach in a medical school, and the medical students do undergo quite a bit of training, right, in this. And especially, if they're going into surgery, they have an entire residency, right? And several year residency that, if it's general surgery, there's different kinds of surgery, right? But he had to have been trained on how to do this stuff. I mean, you got a large vessel.
I'm sorry. I'm laughing because we're all just
this thing. It's like what, stop the bleeding.
Right.
How could you not know that? I don't know. I mean, I don't know.
Just from my perspective. So I served as a medic in the Army for 6 years. And what they taught us is, if you ever have to open up an abdomen, you should not see blood, find the bleeding and stop it.
Correct.
Not that I'm doing surgical cases out in the field, but if I have a gunshot wound or a blast victim, I need to get the bleeding to stop.
Correct. That's your primary goal.
How do you
right?
do that?
Keep the blood pressure up.
Find the pulsing vessel and put your fingers over it and put a clamp on it.
It if you can. Like, I mean, again, you may not have
clamp whatever you find has blood coming out of it. Just do it. And they've come
out. That's pretty straightforward. I mean, even I think a layperson might know how to like do that. I don't know, like, but a surgeon, I mean, come on, like
I think that's like, well, we're having some pauses here. We're just kind of all scratching our head. And
I don't know.
And just backing up to the psychology part, reading some of the statements by the staff, is he was a very cavalier person, like, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
Well, and then there was also a complaint in the document filed with the court, is in their exact verbiages, he would often invoke religious symbols and concepts in order to redirect conversations to placate patients who had had significant complications following his surgery.
Ooh, interesting.
Oh, I love that you mentioned this, because
interesting.
That's so interesting, because I actually see that come up often, and people can use the God card, the religious card, anything, all of a sudden, right? Invoke God, because you're not going to argue with God, or if bring up that you're.
Why would you challenge anybody's religious convictions?
Yeah. Well, again,
I have a thing about that.
The cavalierness. So again, we haven't assessed this guy, but again, talking in generalities, we do know, like both of Dana and I, we know a lot about psychopathy. We deal with psychopaths quite regularly. I've dealt with them for years, so I'm pretty adept at detecting signals, from psychopaths in terms of their behavior disposition. And so, generally they come off as very charming and, again, like very approachable and all of that. But they also, they engage in these, again, these blame shifting behaviors, and oftentimes, there's a lot of manipulation, right? In terms of if they've done something improper, it's always shifted off to somebody else. So there's really sophisticated manipulation schemes that they engage in. We also know that, and this is from the research from, Hare, who's the psychopathy guru, Dr. Robert Hare, is that surgeons are overrepresented in, in the psychopathy base rates. In other words, we know that the psychopathy is, generally about 1% of the population would meet criteria to be classified as a psychopath. But surgeons, it's much higher than that. It's, there's estimates that 8%, I think, is what's in my head. Dana, do you know for sure what the percentage is, what they've estimated? We know that surgeons are kind of up at the top there. Might want to look at that real quick, but a really good, this is more, and CEOs, right? So CEOs, or people that are high up in business structures, business hierarchies, they're overrepresented as well. We know that from the research. I'm not saying we don't have we don't know about this guy specifically, but
no. And I use that word as an uneducated. It's like I'm not, but the terminology keeps coming to mind when I'm reading the notes about him.
Well, right, because you look at the behaviors, and so yes, we can see, we start looking at this cunning, manipulative kind of behavior, pulling the God card out, that kind of stuff, doing things that shift attention and focus, right, from their mistakes or from anything that would be once they're at a focus, right, of an investigation or something. Mm-hmm. See that all the time. So interesting. Yeah. Did you get the percentage?
Well, I saw a study by
I'm curious now because
Dutton 2012
I should know this,
found that surgeons rank. A study by Dutton 2012 found that surgeons rank among the top 10 professions most likely to attract individuals with psychopathic traits. So we know that. I don't have the exact statistics here, but some of the traits found in surgeons are fearlessness, which is necessary for handling high risk, high pressure situations. Low empathy, right? That can be useful when performing procedures.
Yeah, especially if you have patients that do die when you're performing surgery on them. So if you're an empath, right? If you're really high in empathy, you could be profoundly affected if you don't save somebody, right? Because not everybody survives surgeries, right? Think gunshot victims, they try, but I've watched several die in my career on the table, in the ER bay, in the trauma bay, where they're trying to stop the bleeding. They try to get them to surgery real quick. If you're an empath, that stuff's going to really impact you. So, it can be adaptive to have some of these traits. So it's not that, we do see those psychopathic traits, and sometimes those are adaptive for certain professions, cut rate, business.
And I've seen it before they even take them to. So I used to work trauma ICU, but we took surgical patients as well. And even in this case, Dr. Shaknovsky only spent about 5 minutes with the family before the surgery. 5 or 10 minutes before the surgery. So if you're an empath, you're not sitting at bedside and reassuring your patients. Mm-hmm. You're just telling what you're going to do and what they're going to do because they have to do it. And I have seen that so many times. I had a gunshot victim that I took care of one time. His spinal cord had been severed. And so they weren't going to take him to surgery because it was inoperable.
Right.
That surgeon refused to come and talk to him. Mm-hmm. I had to call the hospital. I had to call the hospital, the medical officer. Hey, can you come and talk to this guy, please? I can only tell him so much as a nurse, but I need somebody with a license behind their name to come and tell this man that what he's going to experience for the rest of his life.
Right. To say he's going to be paraplegic, probably. Yeah.
And funnily enough, that's a surgeon that I had to stop taking a patient to surgery because he reeked of alcohol. So they don't, I've seen it a lot where they don't.
There are good surgeons out there. I don't want to I don't want to paint it like, there are definitely surgeons they're empathic and all that. I'm not trying
No.
to.
And I think that
We
I've
got
seen
people
some,
canceling their surgeries, right?
Yeah. They're like, oh my God.
I think the ones that have a good rapport with their patients, there's so many of those, and I've seen so many of them. But when we encounter those few, we're just like, yeah, that's the one I remember the most.
Well,
and
we haven't talked about we haven't talked about psych screening and stuff. We've talked about this in other podcasts, and I know we're getting towards the end of this, but again, it also begs the question about whether or not we talk about how psychologists might benefit. Before we become a psychologist, maybe we should make sure you're actually psychologically healthy and fit. Like in other words, are you fit to actually do therapeutic interventions and therapeutic work with people, or are you suffering from severe personality stuff that would render you incompetent in terms of being able to help other people? And that's an argument that is going around, but we don't do that, and physicians don't go through any kind of psychological screenings or anything like that either before they get their medical license. And so it's one of those things that is interesting because we don't do that. Air traffic controllers, we want to make sure we psychologically screen those folks, right? Lots of lives are in their hands. So it's an interesting kind of argument, isn't it? It's like, I wonder if some kind of psychological screening should be incorporated here, just because it may or may not catch some of these highly incompetent, personality disordered, physicians or doctors who have substance use problems, that kind of stuff. So anyway, it's something to think about.
Definitely. What were some of the other things that they ranked high with, as far as lack of empathy?
High confidence also is a skill, a trait that's found in surgeons. Cold rationality, helping them make life or death decisions without emotional interference. So there's certain traits of people that are more prone to be interested in being these fields of work. And I always recommend anyone to get a psychological evaluation. Just everyone should at some point in their life to assess their mental health or well-being. And as a psychologist, I also assess other mental health clinicians. They're referred to me by the board to evaluate when they're in trouble or on probation or for certain ethical violations. So I assess them. I always recommend people, before you're court ordered or before your license is on the line, even before you start school, talk to a professional, get evaluated, and just make sure if there's something there that's showing up, even on a lower level, I, as a psychologist, can help give you some direction, right, to take care of these issues, whether it's personality pathology or some mood disorder or some untreated mental health problem, to get taken care of, because it'll show up later in a bigger way. And I can tell you that people that are high in narcissistic traits or high in psychopathy, they're not booking appointments with me, by the way.
No.
They're not.
They don't come into they don't come into treatment generally unless they're ordered to. And so this is again why they can go out and they can do a lot of damage, right, to people, and until they're identified and caught. And this is why, again, psychopathy is definitely it's a problem. I mean, it's not that there are psychopaths in all professions. They're in everywhere. There's in psychologists. They're in, pretty much all professions, right? But there's just some that have higher representations of people who have those traits. Some of them are adaptive. There's actually some research that suggests that some psychopathic traits can be helpful, believe it or not, in some instances, in some settings. So it's not always that it's bad, but when you combine it with other, like you say, like Dana's talking about the narcissistics, we call it the triad of narcissism and Machiavellianism and these sorts of things where, you have this grandiose sense of like, how, you're perfect. You're so important. You don't recognize your own faults. You have no insight, and you end up hurting other people. That's where it becomes a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't take ownership for anything. It's like you make mistakes or you do something wrong, and it's like you blame shift everything to somebody else, and deny all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I have some cases right now with folks that are high in narcissistic traits and some other traits too, antisocial, but they're all court ordered to be seen by me.
Right.
And why? Because they violated the law. They have a restraining order. They've maybe lost custody of their kids. There are some other legal problems. I see them a lot in family law court-ordered evals. And here's the thing. They don't take feedback. They disagree with what you say. They are very resistant to treatment. And they are usually ordered by the court to participate in treatment. You know what they do? They don't.
They pretend to. They might pretend
to.
Yeah.
They buy a therapist to like fake documents. I even had one guy like lie and say he did the treatment. They'll do everything else. And so then it becomes more of a problem, and they're so resistant to seeing any flaw within themselves. And unfortunately, it causes more and more problems for them. And so we don't want these individuals getting into these career fields because they are, in fact, dangerous.
They are dangerous, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I agree.
And I want to talk about these folks on their way, they're in school. And look, school is humbling. I know, Craig and I know. It's like you get a lot of feedback. You get to find out your it's tough, right, on your ego. You feel dumb. I mean, so look, narcissists have a hard time making it through school and being able to give feedback or correction. And a lot of times they break the rules and cheat, which begs the question, like some of these folks that are getting licensed, like how did they?
Right. It goes back to the training issue I talk about, which is like, I'm just baffled about like, I going back to this particular doctor, I would love to see what his training records look like. Was he like incompetent? And did he barely get through, his residency, or, was he this gold star, surgeon? Because there's quite a bit of variability, right, in terms of competence level when we're talking about, surgery. I mean, it's presumably very complex to, conduct, to perform surgery, depending on, what organs you're talking about. So that's just what I would love to see that. And it's going to come out in Discovery for sure. They're likely going to get all those records.
Well, we haven't even had a chance to look through the entire 500-page suit that they filed.
I know. It's
I wonder if it's buried in there. I'll definitely be reading.
It could be buried in there. I like I said, on my computer, and I have a gaming computer. It's very fast, and this thing took a while to down. Like it was having trouble because it's almost 500 pages. It's like that is a very, very large complaint.
I want to shout out to the paralegals and the legal team that put this together, because this is
exactly
that. Very
that took a while to put together, right? They're using AI to help them, but it's like, oh my God.
So lastly, Shannon, share with us, you're a licensed nurse. You work with other nurses. There were plenty of licensed professional staff who, during these procedures, made observations, right?
Mm-hmm.
They saw things. And, maybe they they changed their documentation, right? Or they did certain things. Like, tell me some of your thoughts.
So there are nurses named in this case. One of which is being named specifically because she didn't label the specimen as a liver. But from reading, like I said earlier, from reading the documentation of her statement, she was pressured by the surgeon to keep the label spleen on the container. There are numerous statements by the nurses who attended this case is that they wouldn't bring their family members to have surgery by him. Some even stated that they were very uneasy about the timing of the case because it was scheduled in the late afternoon and it was called a skeleton crew, which I'm not sure exactly what that means, but from what I understand, there wasn't a second surgeon or hand or a PA to assist in the case. It was another nurse who was holding retractors. The scrub nurse at one point did state that he never asked for any clamps. He never asked for any ligature or any other pieces of equipment to stop bleeding. There were additional nurses called into the case while Mr. Bryant was open to assist in handling the bowel. They do state, or the attorney states that nurses did not raise alarm to the fact that Dr. Shaknovsky was operating on the wrong side of the abdomen. However, I'm wondering if that's going to come into question because the statements given by the nurses that they couldn't see anything because they were managing this large bowel that was spilling out of the abdomen and they were having to work to keep healthy while he was working. There was only one nurse that was able to see into the abdomen, and I do call into question what she stated because he used ligature to clamp vessels when quite obviously on autopsy that was not the case. They didn't find anything clamped or sutured or cauterized. So
and she said that he did that.
Yes, she did.
So again, that is obviously a misstatement. And I'm assuming they're not. Are there any sort of video surveillance in these surgery suites now? In other words, do they record the surgeries? Like, are there any cameras in the surgery suites? I don't know if there are. I'm just curious.
I haven't seen that there are. I don't ever remember knowing that they are because remember I used to work at that hospital. Mm-hmm. And I definitely think they would have pulled the footage. I do see where they were even pulling the documentation on who badged in and badged out of the surgery theater.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So obviously if it's there, they'll be using it in the case.
Sure.
So back to the nurses, they are stating that why didn't they stop him from operating on the wrong side of the body? And I think a defensible point is that they couldn't see. And that's multiple nurses state that they couldn't see anything because there was such a large bowel in the way and they were helping maintain the bowel. And once the code started, they were all running around trying to get blood. They had 2 cell savers going, doing chest compressions, probably getting blood from the blood bank. So you cease all help and you do the chest compressions, of which there was poor visibility into the abdomen because of all the blood. And Dr.
He went in cardiac arrest, right? He probably arrested, right? And
correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And so that's when Dr. Shaknovsky took out the livers when he couldn't even see. So that'd be interesting to see from that perspective why they named the nurses. But of course, they probably did it just to bring everybody in. They're going to name everybody.
Everyone's going to get named. And then, as the case progresses, generally in these cases, what will happen is as they take depositions and they go through discovery, they will, if there's evidence that, okay, this defendant clearly has no liability in this, they will usually dismiss them. They will get a dismissal. They will dismiss them from the case. But yeah, I think the general strategy is usually in these cases is they're going to name everybody that's present in that surgical suite, the surgical field and all that who are participating. And then discovery is where they figure out, where the liability lies, specifically.
Well, and I also feel like their hands were tied immediately after the case because when you're a nurse and there's an accident made, you are told not to talk to anybody.
Uh-huh.
You do not blink the wrong way. You don't approach the family. So I do hope they drop this against the nurses because I also know from personal experience that when a surgeon's coming at you, you don't try to fight back. You don't verbally.
Oh yeah, there's a hierarchy. Absolutely. Right. Yeah.
And so I really, truly and hope that, because I do know some of the nurses personally, and I know that my heart goes out to them. Can you imagine being named in this case of how?
Oh yeah,
that just to scare the pants off of me.
That's terrible. Yeah, anytime you get named in a lawsuit, I mean, I don't know if Dana's been sued, but I've been sued. As a doctor, I've been sued, and it's stressful because, again, you don't know if cases go to jury trial, you just don't know what's going to happen. And some cases are frivolous, right? Not all cases have merit, but yeah, I mean, it's anytime you get sued, it's tremendous stress, because, again, yes, you'll likely be indemnified, but like I said, there's some cases where indemnification may not entirely protect you, and judgments may be levied against you as an individual as well. So that's where your malpractice insurance comes into play. I don't think nurses have to have malpractice insurance. Is that correct? Unless you're a nurse practitioner, maybe. But
no, we don't.
You generally don't, but doctors do. So
right. I think so. I didn't see where they viewed any of the nurses' documentation. Not yet. I haven't seen that, or even naming it. I do see where they repeatedly say in both the ACA report and the suit filed is that Dr. Shaknovsky's history of incorrectly documenting surgeries in the past was even poor. And this case was grievously poor. Didn't even identify the word megacolon, which this gentleman had, which placed him at risk for surgical complications, meaning he should have been at a higher level of care, because Miramar Beach, the Sacred Heart Hospital in Miramar is a small community hospital. It's not very big. They did not have many services. We would wind up transferring them out to a higher level of care to receive services such as urology services or gastrointestinal services. If they had a gastrointestinal bleed. So, and then the nurses did say, why are we doing a spleen here? He's never done he stated he had done 3 or 4 spleens there, but they found out he had not done a spleen there. Spleens can bleed fast and quick. And then with the surgical complication of the megacolon, this is not a patient they should have touched in this hospital. And the nurses go to say that extensively. Every single one of them make that statement. Why are we doing this here? This is not. And but it goes back to his documentation. They really hammer that in both reports, is that his documentation, both in the past and on this case, were always wrong. Nothing was ever documented very well. And it goes back. The hospital knew. So
the hospital is going to be on the hook for this one for sure. I mean, liability is going to extend out to just the hospital and the physician for sure.
But I do know where I come into play. I did not look at this case as a legal nurse consultant. I'm just coming in as a layperson looking at the documentation available to me online. But as a legal nurse consultant, if I was handed a case like this, we're creating chronologies. Okay, so what time did everything start? From the time he walked into the ER with his first complaint to statements from the nurses, his vital signs. One of the reasons Dr. Shaknovsky used to convince the family to have this surgery was that he was clinically unstable. He was not clinically unstable. His vital signs speak to that. His laboratory reports speak to that. And so that's something I would find and put into a spreadsheet showing, okay, this time, and this time, all these things happened, marking even the place in the medical record you can find it. And then how things happened in the OR. A lot of nurse consultants, I've not done it yet, but we actually help attorneys come up with questions to ask people they're deposing. Some nurse consultants will sit in on the deposition and help the attorney respond with relevant questions. It's actually something I really like to do.
That's the fun part. Yeah, I enjoy that as well. As far as like from the psychological stuff, we can provide that expertise as well to lawyers.
Right.
Bring me in there. I would love to ask this surgeon some questions, right? I got some good questions for you, right? We know how to disarm a narcissist.
Yeah.
Like,
I
yeah.
would
So
love to learn how to do that. All
Well,
I know is how
we
to
know, and we know how to,
gray rock.
we also know how to trigger them, right? To get responses that would demonstrate like, oh, this person just became unhinged during their deposition.
I would
not
I would
favorable.
love to be a fly on the wall during his deposition, and I would love to see him deposed with a psychologist at but going back to that, I generate reports. I generate very detailed reports telling a story of exactly what happened from point A to point B until the discharge of the patient or the death, with diagrams, definitions. I generated a 16-page report on a guy who had compartment syndrome that was missed, and I narrowed it down to pain and suffering of 26 hours. This complication went 26 hours of not being diagnosed, and I was able to lay that all out for the attorney without him having to go through thousands of pages. Sometimes these medical records are 4,000 or 5,000 pages long. Give me that job. Let me do that. That's my jam. I want to dig in there. I want to do the investigation. I just found this golden nugget. Ooh, let me tell you about it. And I'm going to give you a really detailed report on it. And I'm going to provide the studies and the standards of care to back that up.
That is the fun part of this, right? Like that. I mean, I agree with you that I enjoy that kind of work as well. It's investigative, but it's all,
I also like finding when healthcare professionals did their job to the very best of their ability, and that they served the patient and the family well. I love those cases because sometimes families bring in a case and they say, I don't know what happened. Something must have happened. Dad was okay a few days ago. And I dig into the medical chart and I say, oh, well, the facility did everything they could, but sadly it was just Dad's time. Or there was past medical history the family had no idea about. A lot of people keep things from their families that they don't know about, and it leads to their demise. And I'm very thankful to be able to share that information to the family because I feel like it gives them closure. I've done that a couple of times. So not every case that's handed to me is a slam dunk, we're going to get everybody. No, sometimes I would say a third of the cases that I review, thousands of pages long, is simply it was not, there was nobody negligent. It just happened. There was an accident. There was, they coded it home. The fact they made it to the facility is a miracle. So I like those cases too. So, and I have worked defense before. I have defended facilities. I'm very glad to do that because while we've been bashing on a physician in here, I really love portraying the good work that physicians and nurses do, because nursing and working in a hospital as a physician is hard. You're dealing with death every single day, pain. They call it acute moral injury. I mean, you get burned out, but you still keep pushing and you still keep serving because you love people. And there's so many hospital physicians and nurses who do that. Housekeepers, our techs, lab assistants, pathology, they all see it and they still go to work day in and day out when most people couldn't hack it. And I love proving that. I love proving that people did receive the very best of care that was possible. So I just want to put that in there because we have poor Dr. Shaknovsky. He's going to be hiding under a rock for the rest of his life. But and I really want to speak to the nurses, and I do want to say this aside. The nurses and physicians at Sacred Heart Hospital in the Emerald Coast are some of the best I've ever worked with. I worked there for 6 years because I loved working there. The charge nurses, and I have to reveal my husband was hospitalized there with COVID, and they all did the very best they could by him. The physicians, they were all so wonderful to him. And so that's evidence. I drove an hour to take my husband to a hospital that I worked at because I love that hospital. And so that's all I had to say.
Well, Shannon, I would love to work with you on a case, any case that comes up, to have you just review those thousands of pages of medical records and I appreciate you sharing the work that you do and highlighting the importance of it. And so thank you. Let people know just where they can find you if you want to hire a legal nurse consultant.
The best place to reach me right now is on LinkedIn, under the name Shannon Boyett. Real simple. No E on the end of Boyett. Send me a message. I did put a phone number in one of my posts, but I'm still getting that all together. So I'm always more than happy for people to just reach out and ask me questions. I do merit review. I do the long investigative reviews with reports. And then I can also suggest who you should hire as a witness, an expert witness, both physicians and nurses, depending on the specialty that was involved in the case. And I can even find those people for you. I know that's super hard sometimes to find the expert witness for a specific issue that, you might be dealing with. So, and then I find, I think that's it. Anyways, and I don't have a hard and fast rule of how I produce a work product. I do what you ask me to do. If you want a report, I give it to you all. If you don't want a report, you just want a verbal conversation, that's how I work too. It's really, I tailor my services to the individual attorney's needs. That's it.
Thank you so much. And of course, you can consult with any of us at any time. You can book a consult at psychologydoctor.com. That's psychologydr.com. You can find all of us on that website. You can click and book online. You can click and book a 30-minute consult or an hour. And if you have a legal case and you need help or feedback, I encourage you to do that. 1 hour of your time can help direct you and give you feedback about your case. And then if you want to retain us in any capacity, we can go from there. But thank you, Dr. Wetter. Thank you, Shannon Boyett. I really appreciate your legal expertise.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. It's a great conversation.
Thanks for listening. For episode details and merch, check out killerpsychologistpodcast.com. And for forensic services, you can book online at psychologydr.com. That's psychologydoctor.com.